Hercule Poirot and the Two-Gun Mystery.
Chapter 1. The Illness of Poirot and the Unexpected. Visitor, Hercule. Poirot lay unusually still. The great detective, whose mind was sharper than any blade and more precise than any clockwork mechanism, was now confined to his bed. The room was warm, carefully arranged and perfectly ordered, yet even that could not disguise the fact that Poirot was unwell. A persistent fever had weakened him, forcing him into a rare state of rest that he deeply disliked. At his bedside sat Captain Arthur Hastings, his loyal friend and companion. Hastings was used to seeing Poirot in control, always observing, always thinking several steps ahead. But today, Poirot's eyes were half-lidded, his expression unusually fatigued. Yet even in illness, there was still something unmistakably sharp about him. "You must not look at me like that, mon ami," Poirot murmured faintly, adjusting himself against the pillows. "I am not dying. I am merely temporarily offended by my own body." Hastings smiled faintly. "You should be resting, Poirot, not analyzing your condition like one of your cases." Poirot gave a small, dignified sigh. "Resting is acceptable, but useless rest is not." The room fell quiet again, broken only by the distant ticking of a small clock on the mantel. Hastings tried to relax, though he could feel the strange tension that always existed in Poirot's presence, even in silence. It was as if something unseen was always waiting. Then came a knock at the door. A maid entered cautiously. "Captain Hastings, sir, there is a gentleman outside. He insists it is urgent. He says he must speak to Monsieur Poirot immediately." Hastings frowned. "Did you tell him Poirot is ill?" "Yes, sir, but he refuses to leave." From the bed, Poirot opened his eyes slightly. "Ah, urgency. That word is rarely used for trivial matters." Hastings hesitated. "I'll speak to him. You should rest." Poirot gave a slow nod. "Yes. Yes, see what this urgency is made of." Hastings stepped out into the corridor. A young man stood there, nervous, pale. His coat was slightly wet from the outside mist, and his hands trembled as if he had been holding something heavy for too long, perhaps not physically, but emotionally. "Are you Captain Hastings?" the man asked quickly. "I am." "I need to see Monsieur Poirot. It is about a murder." Hastings immediately stiffened. "Poirot is unwell. You must explain it to me." The man hesitated, swallowing hard. "My name is Edward Lorimer. My uncle has been murdered." There was a pause. Hastings studied him carefully. The man did not look like someone exaggerating. His distress was real, but controlled. Too controlled. "A murder?" Hastings repeated. "Yes, inside a locked room. No sign of forced entry. No clear suspect. The police are confused, and I fear something far worse is happening than they understand." Hastings exhaled slowly. Cases like this always carried Poirot's interest. Locked rooms, impossible circumstances, deceptive simplicity. Still, Poirot was ill. "I will speak to him," Hastings said finally. "Wait here." He returned to the bedroom. Poirot's eyes opened before Hastings even spoke. "You have that look," Poirot said softly. "The look of a man who has just been handed a problem he does not wish to carry." Hastings sat down. "There's been a murder? A locked room case?" Immediately, Poirot's expression shifted slightly, interest piercing through fatigue. "Ah," Hastings continued. "A young man, Edward Lorimer. His uncle was killed in a sealed room. No forced entry, no obvious suspect." Poirot's fingers lightly tapped the blanket. A habit, thinking. "And he wishes me to travel?" Poirot asked. "Yes, immediately." Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. His breathing remained calm, but Hastings could sense the internal calculation already forming. Then Poirot shook his head slightly. No. Hastings blinked. No? I am not in a condition to travel. A mind may function while the body rests, yes, but a journey requires both. I will not be of use in my current state. Hastings looked disappointed. But Poirot, this sounds serious. Poirot raised a hand, gently. Seriousness does not require my physical presence. It requires my mind. He opened his eyes again, now sharper than before. You will go? Me? Hastings asked, surprised. Yes, and I will guide you. Hastings hesitated. Guide me? How? Poirot gave a faint smile. Telegrams, notes, questions, observations. You will become my eyes, Hastings. I will remain here, but the case will not be without me. Hastings was not entirely convinced. You're trusting me to solve a murder? Poirot's expression softened slightly, almost amused. I am trusting you to walk where I cannot. The thinking, I will do that part. There was a pause. Then Poirot added quietly, and Hastings, do not try to think like me. That would be disastrous. Simply observe. I will do the rest. Hastings sighed. Very well, I'll go. At that moment, Edward Lorimer was brought into the room briefly. He looked surprised to see the famous detective in bed. There was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. You are ill? Edward asked. Yes, Poirot replied calmly. Edward looked uncertain. Then, can you still help me? Poirot studied him for a long moment. Not just his face, but his posture, his breathing, the way his eyes shifted when he spoke. Yes, Poirot said finally. I can help you. Edward looked relieved. Then you will come? Poirot shook his head. No, but my friend will go in my place. Edward turned to Hastings. That will have to be enough, I suppose. Poirot interrupted softly. It will be more than enough, if you tell him everything. Edward nodded quickly. Of course. As Edward left the room, Poirot turned his gaze toward Hastings. Mon ami, he said quietly, this case, it already smells wrong. Hastings frowned. What do you mean? Poirot closed his eyes again, but his voice remained steady. Locked rooms are never truly locked, and murders that appear simple are always the most carefully constructed lies. Hastings felt a slight chill. Poirot continued, Go carefully. Watch not only what people say, but what they choose to show you. Then after a pause, he added one final line. And Hastings, do not trust anyone who is too calm. Outside, the world remained quiet. But somewhere beyond that quiet, a murder had already begun to unfold into something far more complex than anyone yet understood. And even from his bed, Hercule Poirot was already inside the case. Chapter 2. The Journey to Blackridge Manor. The morning train cut through the countryside like a steel blade through mist. Captain Hastings sat by the window, watching the landscape blur past. Fields, hedgerows, distant chimneys dissolving into a grey sky. Beside him sat Edward Lorimer, unusually silent now that the journey had begun. The urgency that had marked his arrival at Poirot's residence seemed slightly dulled, as though the motion of the train had forced him into a more controlled, introspective state. Yet, Hastings could not shake the feeling that something about Edward was carefully arranged, like a man wearing an expression chosen in advance. From his pocket, Hastings pulled a folded telegram. Poirot's instructions. Observe everything, especially contradictions, especially silence. Hastings exhaled. That man never changes, he muttered. Edward glanced at him. Did Monsieur Poirot send instructions? Yes, as usual. Edward gave a faint, nervous smile. He is very famous for that, isn't he? Solving cases without even being there. He prefers it that way, Hastings replied. There was a pause. The train rattled gently. Then Edward spoke again, more quietly. "My uncle was not an easy man." Hastings turned toward him. "Tell me about him." Edward hesitated. "He was wealthy, very wealthy, but difficult. He trusted no one. He changed his will often. He enjoyed control more than kindness." Hastings nodded slowly. "And your family lived with him?" "Yes, after my parents died he took us in, me and my wife." That detail caught Hastings' attention. "Your wife was there at the house when it happened?" Edward nodded. "Yes." "And she is, Eleanor Lorimer." Something in Edward's tone softened slightly when he said her name, but it was not relief. It was something more complicated. Attachment mixed with tension. Hastings observed him carefully. Poirot's voice echoed in his mind again. "Do not trust those who are too calm." Edward was not calm, but he was controlled. That was something else entirely. The train slowed as they approached a rural station. Blackridge Manor lay beyond it. A local inspector met them on the platform, a tall man with tired eyes and the expression of someone who had already decided this case would not end well. "You're from Poirot's team?" the inspector asked Hastings. "Yes." The inspector gave a slight grunt. "Shame he couldn't come." "He was unwell." The inspector nodded but seemed unimpressed. "We'll manage." Edward stepped forward. "Inspector, thank you for coming." The inspector glanced at him. "Let's go. The house is waiting, and so is the mess." They travelled by carriage toward Blackridge Manor. The road narrowed as they left the town behind. Trees became thicker. The air felt heavier, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Finally, the manor appeared. Blackridge Manor stood like a forgotten memory. Old stone, tall windows, and an atmosphere that seemed permanently suspended between decay and pride. The sky above it was dull and unmoving. Hastings felt it immediately. Something had happened here, and it had not yet finished happening. Inside, the house was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. A servant greeted them at the door, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and trembling hands. "You've come about the murder?" she said without greeting. "Yes," Edward replied. Her gaze flicked to Hastings and the inspector. "It happened in the West Wing. Mr. Lorimer was found there." She led them through long corridors filled with heavy curtains and old portraits that seemed to watch them pass. Hastings noticed Edward walking slightly ahead now, as though eager to reach the center of something he already knew too well. At the end of the corridor, the servant stopped. "That's the room," she said quietly. A police seal was still on the door. The inspector broke it and opened the room. Hastings stepped inside. The room was large, richly furnished, yet disturbingly still. A fireplace stood unlit. A heavy desk lay slightly turned, and near the far side of the room, on the carpet, was a dark stain that had already been partially cleaned, but not fully erased. The body was gone. Moved. But the memory of violence remained. The inspector spoke. "We removed the body for examination." Hastings nodded but kept observing. "No forced entry," the inspector said. "Door was locked from inside. Window closed from the inside too. We had to enter through force after breaking it open." Hastings walked slowly across the room. Every detail mattered. No signs of struggle. No overturned furniture. Yet death had happened here. "Where was the gun?" Hastings asked. The inspector pointed to a table. "We found one here, and another one later outside the property." Hastings frowned. "Two guns?" "Yes, one fired, one not." Edward stood silently near the doorway watching. Hastings noticed something. Edward was not looking at the room like a man discovering a tragedy. He was looking at it like a man confirming a story. That disturbed Hastings more than anything else. Later in the hallway, the servant was questioned again. She was trembling more now. "I told the police everything," she said. "After dinner? A visitor came?" "A visitor?" Hastings asked. "Yes, at 9 o'clock. "What kind of visitor?" She hesitated. "A man, tall, thick beard. I didn't know him." Edward interrupted quickly. "Did you hear what they spoke about?" "No," she said. "I left them alone." "And then?" the inspector asked. "A shot. 10 minutes later. Maybe less." Hastings looked at Edward. "And the door was locked?" "Yes," the servant said, "from the inside." A locked room again. Hastings felt a familiar frustration building. Poirot would have called this pattern too neat, because nothing in real life was ever neat. A little later, Edward's wife arrived, Eleanor Lorimer. Hastings saw her before she spoke. She was striking, composed, elegant, and unsettlingly calm. Not the calm of innocence, but the calm of someone trained to control reaction. She greeted Hastings with a polite nod. "Thank you for coming," she said. Hastings studied her carefully. "Where were you when it happened?" "In my room." "And you heard nothing?" "A gunshot," she replied simply. "Then I came downstairs." "And the door?" "Locked." Her answers were smooth, too smooth. Hastings noted it immediately. Poirot would not like this, he thought, or perhaps he would like it too much. That evening, Hastings stood by the window of his assigned room. Outside, Blackridge Manor sat in darkness. He pulled out his notebook and wrote, "Locked room, murder, 2 guns, bearded visitor, calm wife missing servant." Something was wrong. Not slightly wrong, structurally wrong, as if the entire situation had been arranged to be misunderstood. He thought of Poirot again. Back in his bed, far away, the detective would already be building the invisible shape of the truth. Hastings looked out into the dark estate, and for the first time he felt it clearly. This was not a murder that wanted to be solved. It was a murder that wanted to be believed. Chapter 3. The Impossible Murder. Morning arrived at Blackridge Manor without warmth. The sky remained pale and lifeless, as though the sun itself hesitated to fully rise over the estate. Captain Hastings stood in the corridor outside the west wing, staring at the sealed room that had become the center of everything. A locked door, a broken silence, and a murder that refused to make sense. Inspector Mallory arrived shortly after dawn, carrying a thick file under his arm and the expression of a man who had spent too many hours on a case that offered him nothing in return. "We've completed the initial examination," he said bluntly. "The body has been sent for post-mortem." Hastings nodded. "Any updates?" The inspector gestured toward the room. "Come inside." The West Wing room was now officially treated as a crime scene. Even without the body, its presence lingered. The carpet still bore faint, dark traces that cleaning could not fully erase. The air felt stale, trapped, as though the room itself had refused to exhale since the moment of death. Inspector Mallory pointed toward the desk. "2 firearms," he said. "One was found here, near the body's original position. The second was discovered later, about 4 miles from the estate, discarded in a field." Hastings frowned. "Both linked to the same case?" "Yes," Mallory replied. "Ballistics confirm 1 bullet fired from the weapon inside the room. The second gun still has 1 round missing." Hastings walked slowly across the room, eyes scanning every detail. No broken furniture, no struggle marks, no signs of forced entry. Yet a man had been killed here. "In a locked room," Hastings murmured. Mallory nodded. "Door was bolted from the inside, window was shut and latched. We had to break the lock to enter." Hastings stopped near the fireplace. Something about the arrangement felt deliberate, Not chaotic, not emotional, constructed, as if someone had designed the scene rather than survived it. A knock came at the door. Edward Lorimer entered, followed closely by Eleanor. Hastings immediately noticed the difference in their presence. Edward looked tense, restless. Eleanor, however, remained calm, too calm. Inspector Mallory turned toward them. "We'll need further clarification about last night." Edward nodded quickly. "Of course." Mallory opened his notebook. "Start from the evening." Edward exhaled. "We had dinner at around 8. Everything was normal. My uncle retired to his study afterward." "And then?" Hastings asked. Edward hesitated. "Around 9, a visitor arrived." The inspector looked up sharply. "A visitor?" "Yes," Edward said. "A man, tall, heavy beard. I did not recognize him." Hastings exchanged a glance with Mallory. "A stranger entered the house?" Mallory asked. Edward nodded. "He asked to see my uncle privately. The servant escorted him." Hastings frowned. "You allowed a stranger into the room with him?" Edward's jaw tightened. "My uncle insisted on seeing people who came to him. He never refused visitors." Eleanor spoke for the first time. "He often made strange decisions," she said calmly. "He believed everyone had a purpose." Hastings studied her carefully. No hesitation, no emotional disruption, just controlled recollection. Mallory continued. "The servant confirms this visitor?" Edward nodded. "Yes, she says she saw him. She described him clearly." "Where is this servant now?" Hastings asked suddenly. Edward blinked. She left this morning." Mallory frowned. "Left?" "Yes," Edward said quickly. "She said she was unwell and departed." Hastings' eyes narrowed. "Did she leave an address?" Edward hesitated. "No, she was temporary staff." The inspector closed his notebook slightly harder than necessary. "That's inconvenient." Hastings stepped closer. "Who hired her?" Eleanor answered smoothly. "A small agency in the city." Hastings turned toward her. "Which agency?" She paused for the first time. A fraction too long. "I don't remember the name exactly," she said. Hastings noted that silence immediately. They moved to the window of the room. Outside, the garden stretched out damp and uneven. Hastings leaned forward, scanning the ground. Footprints, many of them, some overlapping, some distorted by rain. Mallory noticed his focus. "We've already examined that." Hastings nodded slowly. "Too many footprints for one person." Edward shifted uncomfortably. There were servants moving around after the discovery. Hastings shook his head. "These patterns, they're confused. Not natural movement. Something happened here that caused panic or staging." Mallory sighed. "Or both." Later they examined the broken window latch. Hastings crouched beside it. "No sign of forced entry," he muttered. "Exactly," Mallory said. Hastings stood, which means whoever entered did so legitimately, or was already inside. A silence followed. Edward looked away. Eleanor did not react. That afternoon, Mallory reviewed the gun found outside the estate. "1 bullet fired," he said. "Distance consistent with being thrown after use." Hastings frowned. "Thrown away deliberately?" "Yes." "And the other gun?" "Clean, no fingerprints of value." Hastings leaned back. "So 1 gun used inside, 1 disposed of outside, 2 different actions?" Mallory nodded, which suggests 2 participants. Edward quickly interrupted. "Or the murderer trying to mislead you?" Hastings glanced at him. That answer came too quickly. As evening approached, Hastings stepped outside the manor alone. The estate was silent again, but silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt arranged. He opened Poirot's telegram carefully. "Observe contradictions, especially human confidence in simple explanations." Hastings exhaled. Everything here was too structured, too carefully divided. Visitor servant locked room, disappearing witness, calm family. It felt like a play with deliberately placed actors. And Hastings was beginning to suspect he had been given the wrong script. That night, he wrote again, no forced entry. 2 guns, staged disposal, witness contradictions, missing servant controlled emotional responses. He paused, then added one final line, something here is not missing, something here is false. Outside his window, Blackridge Manor remained still. But Hastings could no longer shake the feeling that someone inside the house had already decided exactly how the story should be believed. Chapter 4. The Disappearance of Truth. By the 3rd day at Blackridge Manor, Captain Hastings began to feel something he had rarely experienced in his years of assisting Hercule Poirot. Confusion that deepened instead of cleared. It was not the confusion of missing clues, it was the confusion of clues that seemed to contradict one another too perfectly, as though someone had designed the disorder with care. Inspector Mallory had grown increasingly frustrated. He paced the corridor outside the West Wing, muttering to himself and flipping through his notes, as though the answers might suddenly rearrange themselves into clarity. "We're missing something obvious," he said finally. "But I can't see what it is." Hastings did not answer immediately. He was staring at the servant quarters, or rather, what had been the servant quarters, because the elderly servant who had first reported the crime was gone, completely gone. "She left early this morning," Mallory said again for what felt like the 5th time. "No notice, no forwarding address, no record of where she came from." "That doesn't make sense," Hastings replied sharply. "She was the first witness." Mallory shrugged helplessly. "Temporary staff often come through agencies. They disappear just as easily." Hastings did not accept that. Poirot would not accept that. And now Hastings found himself thinking less like a man assisting an investigation, and more like a man trying not to disappoint someone who was not even present. He opened Poirot's latest telegram again. "If a person disappears too easily, Hastings, ask whether they existed in the first place." Hastings frowned at the words. It was typical Poirot, simple on the surface, unsettling underneath. That afternoon, Hastings went into the nearest town alone. The railway station was small, with a single waiting room and a sleepy clerk behind a wooden counter. Hastings approached him directly. "I need information about staff agencies operating in this area." The clerk blinked. "Agencies?" "Yes, domestic staff, maids, servants sent to country houses." The man scratched his head. "There's only one major agency that sends workers out this far." "Name?" "Brackwell Domestic Services." Hastings thanked him and left immediately. Brackwell Domestic Services was a modest office above a tailoring shop. The manager, a thin man with nervous hands, looked increasingly uncomfortable as Hastings questioned him. "We send staff everywhere," he said. "Country homes, estates, hotels." Hastings leaned forward. "Did you send a woman to Blackridge Manor recently?" "Elderly, house servant, arrived about 2 weeks ago." The manager shook his head instantly. "No." Hastings paused. "Think carefully." "I am," the man replied quickly. "We didn't send anyone there recently matching that description." Hastings felt something tighten in his chest. "Are you absolutely sure?" The manager hesitated. "Sir, I can check records again, but I'm certain we have no such placement." Hastings left the office in silence. Outside, the street felt suddenly colder. Back at the manor, Hastings confronted Eleanor. She was sitting in the drawing room, reading a book she had not turned a page of in several minutes. "I went to the agency," Hastings said without preamble. Eleanor looked up slowly. "And?" "They deny sending your servant." A faint pause. Then Eleanor closed her book gently. That is strange. Hastings studied her face. You don't seem surprised. I am surprised, she replied calmly. But I also know mistakes happen. Or lies, Hastings said. A silence followed. Eleanor's gaze remained steady. Inspector Mallory believes the servant existed. Do you? Hastings asked. She smiled faintly. Of course I do. I saw her. That answer should have ended the discussion, but instead it deepened the unease. Because Hastings suddenly realized something troubling. Everyone claimed to have seen her, but no one could prove she existed outside their memory. That evening, Hastings wrote urgently to Poirot. Servant cannot be traced. Agency denies knowledge. Witnesses still insist she existed. Contradiction growing stronger. The reply came faster than expected. Poirot always responded quickly when something interested him. Then Hastings, you are not dealing with one mystery. You are dealing with two realities. One of them is false. Determine which one is constructed. Hastings stared at the telegram for a long moment. Two realities? It sounded absurd. And yet, Blackridge Manor already felt like a place where reality bent slightly out of shape. The next morning, Hastings reviewed Edward Lorimer's timeline again. Edward was cooperative, but nervous. Too nervous in places where he should have been calm, and too calm in places where he should have been nervous. I left for London at 6, Edward repeated for the third time. You already confirmed the train record. Yes, Hastings said. You were on the train. Edward nodded quickly. Then I couldn't have done anything. Hastings watched him carefully. And your uncle was killed around 9? Yes. So between 6 and 9, everything was normal? Edward hesitated slightly. Yes. That hesitation mattered. Poirot had once told Hastings that truth rarely hesitated. People did. Later that day, Hastings reviewed something that had been bothering him since his arrival. Eleanor Lorimer. She was too composed, not emotionally distant, but controlled, as though every reaction had been rehearsed in advance. He remembered her answering questions about the murder with perfect clarity, no emotional disturbance, no confusion. He tested her again. Do you remember exactly what you heard that night? She looked at him. A gunshot. And before that? Nothing unusual. And after? I went downstairs. Hastings paused. And you were alone? Yes. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just structure. Like a carefully delivered performance. That night, Hastings stood in the corridor outside the West Wing again. Mallory was inside, examining the room for the third time. This case is going nowhere, the inspector muttered. Every clue leads back to confusion. Hastings replied quietly. Or design? Mallory looked at him. What do you mean? Hastings hesitated. Sometimes confusion is not accidental. Sometimes it is arranged. Mallory gave a tired laugh. You sound like your detective friend. Hastings did not respond. Because in truth he was beginning to think like Poirot. And that frightened him more than anything else. That night another telegram arrived. Poirot's handwriting was sharper than usual. Hastings, listen carefully. A false person is not always a fake identity. Sometimes it is a role played too perfectly. Look again at the servant, not as a person, but as a function in the story. Hastings read it twice. Then a third time. A role played too perfectly. A function in the story. He looked out of his window toward Blackridge Manor. And for the first time, a disturbing thought formed in his mind. What if the servant was never meant to be found, because she was never meant to exist outside of belief? And what if everything he had seen so far was already part of a carefully constructed illusion? Hastings continued. The bearded visitor, the servant, the confusion around entry and exit, the missing alibis, all of it points in different directions but never resolves. Mallory muttered, "That's what makes it a case." "No," Hastings said, quietly. "That's what makes it a performance." Eleanor's gaze remained steady. "You were suggesting we staged a murder?" Hastings looked at her. "She is not a person. She is a role." Edward blinked. "What are you talking about?" Hastings continued. "A temporary identity, designed to introduce a false witness, to create confusion about timing, presence, and entry." Mallory scoffed. "You're suggesting someone pretended to be an old woman?" Hastings nodded. "Yes." Edward laughed nervously. "That's impossible." Hastings turned toward him. "Is it?" A pause. Then Hastings said quietly, "Your wife is a trained stage actress." The room went still. Even the air seemed to hesitate. Eleanor's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, very slightly. Not fear, recognition. To create a witness who could not be traced. He pointed slightly toward the corridor. The elderly servant who reported the murder was not real in any permanent sense. She was a performance, a disguise, a temporary identity used to seed the story. Edward shook his head. "That makes no sense." "It makes perfect sense," Hastings said, "if the goal was to mislead an investigation from the very beginning." "Are you suggesting I killed my own uncle?" Hastings looked at her steadily. "I am suggesting," he said, "that you and Edward Lorimer constructed a murder designed to look unsolvable." A long silence followed. Then Hastings said the final piece. "But you made one mistake." Chapter 5. Poirot's Revelation. The telegram arrived at Blackridge Manor just after midday. Captain Hastings was in the drawing room when the servant brought it in. The envelope was simple, unmarked, and immediately familiar. Hastings felt that slight tightening in his chest he always experienced when Poirot's mind had reached a conclusion far away from the scene. He opened it at once. Poirot's handwriting was sharper than before, precise, controlled, almost impatient. "Hastings, enough wandering in fog. Return to facts, not stories." Hastings exhaled slowly. Inspector Mallory looked over his shoulder. "More advice from your genius friend?" Hastings did not answer. He continued reading. 3 certainties. The uncle was wealthy and controlled inheritance. The wife is a trained actress. The servant is an impossibility. Hastings frowned. Mallory snorted. "Impossibility? That's helpful." Hastings ignored him and kept reading. "Now, assemble the truth, not the confusion." Hastings closed the telegram slowly, and for the first time since arriving at Blackridge Manor, something in his mind began to align. Not the evidence, the pattern behind the evidence. That evening, Hastings requested a private meeting with Edward and Eleanor Lorimer in the drawing room. The atmosphere was tense before anyone spoke. Edward stood near the fireplace, restless. Eleanor sat calmly in an armchair, hands folded, her expression unreadable. Inspector Mallory remained near the door. Hastings spoke first. "I have reviewed all statements, all evidence, and all contradictions." Edward shifted. "And?" Hastings looked directly at him. "And I believe we have been following a story that was carefully constructed." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Constructed by whom?" Hastings did not answer immediately. Instead, he said, "By people who understood how investigations work." A silence followed. Mallory frowned. "Get to the point, Hastings." Hastings continued. "The servant who reported the murder does not exist in any agency records. She has no identity outside this house, and yet every witness describes her as real." Edward shook his head quickly. That doesn't prove anything. She was here. We saw her. Hastings turned slightly toward him. Did you? Edward hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. Poirot would have called that fraction everything. I am suggesting, he said carefully, that someone staged a version of reality for us to follow. Edward took a step forward. This is absurd. Hastings did not flinch. Is it? Then explain this. Why does every witness contradict the existence of the servant, yet still describe her in identical detail? Silence. Even Mallory did not interrupt. Hastings reached into his coat and placed Poirot's telegram on the table. I was told to look at roles, not people. He looked up, and I finally understand what he meant. He turned toward Eleanor. You are not just a witness in this case. You are part of its construction. Edward immediately protested. That's ridiculous. Hastings raised a hand. Let me finish. He turned back to the room. The uncle was wealthy, controlling. He changed his will frequently. That much is confirmed. Mallory nodded slowly. Hastings continued. Now consider this. Two people stood to benefit most from his death, his nephew and his nephew's wife. Hastings shook his head. No, I am removing fragments that were placed to mislead me. He paced slightly. The locked room is the center of the illusion, but the illusion begins before the murder. He stopped. The servant. Mallory frowned. Again with the servant. Yes, Hastings said, because she is the key. He turned sharply. Hastings continued. An actress does not merely act on stage. She understands transformation, voice, movement, identity. He looked directly at her. And you use that skill here. Mallory frowned. Used it for what? Hastings spoke slowly. Hastings walked to the window. Outside, the manor grounds were still. He continued speaking. Now let us reconstruct what actually happened. He turned back. The uncle was killed inside the room, but not in the chaotic way the scene suggests. Mallory narrowed his eyes. Go on. Hastings spoke firmly. Spoke. The entire sequence was designed in advance. One person leaves early, establishing an alibi. Another remains behind. He looked at Edward. You left for London at 6. Edward nodded quickly. Yes. Hastings continued. You also carried a weapon. Edward froze. Mallory immediately stepped forward. That's a serious accusation. Hastings did not stop. A gun was fired earlier to create confusion, disposed of away from the estate. A second shot completed the act inside the locked room. He turned slightly. And the door being locked from inside, that was not mystery, it was preparation. Eleanor finally spoke. Edward's voice was tight. What mistake? Hastings turned slowly. You underestimated observation. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Poirot's final telegram. He read it aloud. A false identity is never the weakness. It is always the method. Hastings lowered the paper. And the method always leaves a contradiction. Mallory frowned. What contradiction? Hastings answered quietly. The calm. He looked at Eleanor. You are too calm for a woman who witnessed her uncle's murder. Then at Edward. And you are too controlled for a man who claims innocence while surrounded by collapse. The room remained silent. Finally, Hastings said, this case is not about who entered the room. He paused. It is about who designed the story we were meant to believe. A heavy silence filled the drawing room. Outside, Blackridge Manor remained still. But inside, something had finally shifted. Not the truth itself, but the illusion protecting it. And somewhere far away, Hercule Poirot lay in his bed, already knowing the outcome long before Hastings had spoken it aloud.
If you enjoy our story, then like and subscribe. Thank you.